What does love have to do with reshaping the foundations of politics and philosophy? In Plato's hands, love wasn't just affection between people. It became the energy that linked human desire to the ultimate truth. By exploring this connection, you'll see how a seemingly personal feeling was elevated into a bridge between the world you experience and a higher, timeless order of reality. And once you observe how Plato intertwines love, justice, knowledge, and society itself, philosophy seems transformed. But before that broader perspective emerges, we start with a simple yet unsettling question. What if love was never just about individuals at all? Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. Before we begin, just a quick housekeeping note. If you enjoy what I'm doing, a like and subscribe would be really helpful. It goes a long way in keeping the channel going. And don't forget to drop a comment. I'd really love to know what you think. Plato's bold move was to turn love itself into a philosophical concept, not a private feeling, but a principle with the power to elevate the soul towards higher truths. In the Symposium, he described love as something more than an emotion. It inhabits the space between the human and the divine. Love was, for him, a kind of demon, an intermediary, neither mortal nor immortal, neither ignorant nor wise, but forever reaching. It is the restless state of desiring what one does not yet possess, and in this way, Plato cast love as philosophy itself, the love of wisdom embodied in human nature. To ground this abstract role, Plato described love as a climb, a step-by-step ascent often depicted as a ladder. At the very start is the spark of attraction. You see someone's beauty, admire the symmetry of their features, and feel the first pull of desire. This is the lowest rung, but the force of love is restless. It does not stop at one object. As you ascend, you begin to notice that every beautiful body shares a similar quality. They are akin, of the same kind, belonging to one form of beauty, spread across many individuals. The mind realizes that bodily beauty, wherever it appears, points to something shared and unified. It is the first stage of generalization, the initial rational widening of perception. From there, the ascent shifts from the body to the soul. Imagine the joy of discovering intelligence, courage, or justice in a person. At this point, admiration attaches to what endures, to the shape of character and the clarity of thought. These are not as fragile as outward appearances. They do not fade with time in the same way. They hint at more enduring kinds of beauty, patterns that bring you closer to truth. Love ceases to be absorbed in surfaces and begins to recognize inner qualities as worthy objects of affection. Higher still, the ladder broadens again. Love is directed towards practices, laws, and the very structure of society. Instead of admiring individuals, the lover begins to admire order, harmony, and justice within a community. The question is no longer who attracts, but what form of life can sustain goodness. Here, love supports politics and the shaping of cities. When you start to love justice itself, it is no longer enough to keep it private. You want to see it embodied in the world around you. Love begins to extend upward into structures that can outlast any one person. But the ascent does not end there. At the highest rung waits not an object of the senses, but an eternal principle. Plato referred to this as the form of beauty, an ideal that remains constant, unchanging, and indestructible. Unlike the beauty of flesh, or even the beauty of a law, it is not entangled in time. It exists in a pure state, the same across all ages. To grasp it is to uncover the foundation beneath all shifting appearances. This is where love reveals its true power. It guides the soul to ascend from the transient to the everlasting, from what passes to what always is. The image of the ladder illustrates the process. Just as you leave behind each rung as you ascend, so must the soul progress step by step. There is no leap to the summit. The first glimpses come through the senses. Then the intellect discerns patterns, and ultimately the soul itself adjusts to what lies beyond all images. Plato compared this to leaving a cave. At first, the light blinds you, and the shadows seem familiar. But as the eyes grow stronger, you no longer long for the dim shapes, and reality outside becomes clear. Love can bind you to shadows if you mistake beauty solely for surfaces, but it can also free you into the sunlight if you allow it to guide you upwards. This dual role is vital. Love, in Plato's perspective, is never indifferent. Misused, it ensnares individuals in desire, binding them to appetites and pleasures that never entirely satisfy. That's why many confuse love with longing alone, because it clings to the present. But when guided, when educated by reason, this same force becomes a ladder of ascent, lifting you from one level to another until you reach the unchanging. Plato himself was precise with his language here. As the ascent progresses, he ceases even to use the usual words for love or lover. At the higher stages of the dialogue, terms like Iran or Erastes fade away, replaced instead by discourse itself and ultimately the vision of beauty. This change indicates that the focus is no longer on personal attachment, but on the truth that all lesser loves were pointing towards. When you reflect on this role, the concept of love becomes less about private passion and more about the energy of the mind. It is the warmth that propels the study of numbers, the pursuit of justice, and the endeavor to understand what goodness truly is. Love is what connects the thirst of thought with the object that thought desires. Without it, thinking might remain cold or mechanical. With it, philosophy becomes alive and captivating, not just analysis, but aspiration. Plato also outlined the broader consequences. If individuals can ascend this ladder, entire communities could be taught to do the same. A society that recognizes love as a form of education would not leave desire unshaped. Instead, it would direct affection towards virtue, harmony, and the good order of the law. Just as a person can be trained to value intelligence over appearances, so too might a city train its citizens to prioritize justice over comfort. The ladder of love thus becomes a cultural model, serving as a guide not only for personal development, but also for political structuring. This vision changes how you see not only philosophy, but also life itself. The restless desires no longer point downward toward the endless pleasure of the senses. Instead, they point upward, always seeking what is stable. That is what Plato believed was inherent in the human condition, to desire, but never to be truly fulfilled until you join with what is most real. Love alone lifts you from this world to the eternal. So when you next hear the phrase Platonic love, do not imagine a passion deprived of its fire. Instead, consider it a process of transformation. The desire that once clung to superficial charm gives way to the desire to seek truth. The journey begins with attraction, but its destination is understanding. Platonic love is not the absence of longing, but its redirection and refinement towards what can never fade. By framing it this way, Plato inverted the idea of desire. For him, it was not the enemy of wisdom, but an ally when appropriately guided. Every spark of attraction could be the start of an ascent, and every admiration a step toward the universal. Love becomes the bridge connecting two realms, the transient and the eternal, the mortal and the divine. Neither fully one nor the other. It bears the sign of the intermediary, always reaching upwards. That bridge matters because it connects the fractured world of change to the solid ground of what endures. Without love, souls might never move beyond shadows. With it, the path upward becomes more than possible. It's necessary. Love is not just about people, nor even just about beauty. It becomes the mechanism through which human beings push against the limits of sense and glimpse reality itself. But this leads us to a challenge. If love can elevate us beyond appearances, then it is crucial to understand what those appearances are and why they can initially be so deceptive. Plato believed that our daily perceptions deceive us more than we realize. To comprehend his reasoning, we must examine the very nature of vision, knowledge, and the boundary he drew between what appears to be real and what is truly real. Plato believed that knowledge must go beyond the senses. For him, the eyes and ears only catch appearances, never the whole truth. Vision changes with light, perspective, and distance. A straight stick appears bent when submerged in water, and colors vary depending on the surrounding conditions. The same object can appear large up close and tiny from a distance. Sense objects do not simply change, they lack permanence. They contain their qualities only deficiently, much like two sticks that may seem equal at one moment, but inevitably show inequality at another. What the senses provide is always mixed, unstable, and susceptible to reversal. This is why Plato viewed the world through sight, sound, and touch as a constantly shifting tapestry of experience. The senses provide many impressions, but all are subject to change. To navigate life, knowledge needed a fixed point, something unaffected by fluctuation. In his search for permanence, Plato turned to the forms, not shapes in space or impressions in time, but eternal realities that never change. While sensible things exist within time, the forms, by contrast, lie outside it in eternity itself. Time mimics eternity, but it never fully captures it. For Plato, this was the foundation of actual knowledge. The difference is like comparing ripples on water to the riverbed below. Ripples on the surface catch the eye, rising and falling, but they reveal nothing about the ground that supports the flow. The riverbed, hidden yet steady, sustains the entire system. Sense experience is the rippling surface. The forms are the unchanging foundation. If truth means understanding what does not change, then the mind must leave appearances behind and turn towards that enduring order. Ordinary life, however, offers only opinion. Plato used the word doxa to describe this kind of thinking, where perception is transformed into belief. Opinions change as readily as perceptions do. One person may find a sculpture beautiful, while another considers it misshapen. One day may feel hot to you and cold to me. These are not useless claims. They guide everyday exchanges. But none of them transcends shifting appearances. Forming an opinion is like gazing into a mirror. The image bears a likeness, but no matter how precise it appears, it is not the same as the person standing before you. That is what makes it fragile. To Plato, many people spend their entire lives surrounded by these reflections. They mistake the likeness for the real thing. Consider looking into a pond. and seeing your friend's face ripple with every disturbance in the water. You might recognize it, but the wavering picture conceals the actual presence nearby. Sense impressions are like that pond, close enough to suggest reality, yet too unstable to provide certainty. For him, the mind alone could grasp what is truly real with firmness. But how, exactly, does the mind break free? Plato's answer was to show how the intellect discerns the forms. Take equality. You have never once seen perfect equality in the visible world. Two sticks measured side by side will always differ at some level: length, width, or straightness. Yet you carry, without being taught by the eyes, a clear concept of equal itself. Your senses have provided you with countless inadequate examples, but your mind has reached beyond them to grasp the very form. That moment is what Plato called knowledge, a remembering or recognition of realities that the senses can never deliver. Forms like beauty or justice operate similarly. No street, no object, no person can ever be the same as the form of beauty. Yet each beautiful thing draws from that single source, only reflecting a part of it. Behind every judgment of beauty and every admiration lies the form, untouched by season or decay. When the mind sees it, you grasp a truth that does not fade away. That permanence explains why knowledge cannot rest solely on sight, but must be rooted in rational understanding. Notice the distinction. Senses detect change. Intellect seeks what remains constant. Perceptions disperse through moments. Knowledge arranges them into order. For Plato, philosophy is nothing less than this process, ascending from surface impressions towards eternal structure. The mind must learn not merely to gather data, but to align itself with truth. Only then does seeing become an intellectual act rather than a sensory one. This is also why he spoke of education not as accumulating facts, but as guiding the soul out of darkness. His allegory of the cave illustrates this point. In the image, prisoners sit chained, watching shadows as if they were the only reality. They interpret, discuss, and argue about the shapes on the wall. But if one prisoner turns to see the fire, and then finally steps into the sunlight, his entire understanding changes. Shadows symbolize the realm of opinion, while the sun represents truth. The act of turning around exemplifies philosophy itself, the redirection of the soul towards what is real. For Plato's audience, the claim was shocking. In everyday life, seeing meant knowing. "I saw it happen" was conclusive proof. But Plato argued that seeing can deceive just as often as it reveals. The eyes offer a start, but not a conclusion. Without reasoning, they leave the soul lost among reflections. With reasoning, they can help guide the mind to what lies beyond. He was not claiming the senses were pointless, only that relying on them alone leaves you short of actual knowledge. And so, knowledge came to be understood in a new way. There was no longer any belief, or even a belief supported by sensory evidence. Instead, knowledge was the firm intellectual grasp of forms themselves, an act of the mind that unites the knower and the known. In the Republic, Plato described this grasp as a special kind of seeing, not with the body, but with thought itself. It is a cognitive relation, an encounter where the mind connects with what is eternal. When that connection remains secure, knowledge is achieved. When it slips back into appearances, you fall again into opinion. The permanence of this relation explains why knowledge is considered something higher, almost sacred. Since the forms exist outside time, nothing that occurs within the flow of days and years can undo them. You might forget them or fail to understand them, but the truths themselves remain. They exist in eternity, and all time merely imitates their structure. This means that knowledge, once attained, anchors you to something beyond all change. No shifting season, no decline of memory, could alter the reality of the form itself. This division between appearance and reality, sense and mind, opinion and knowledge, shapes philosophy from then on. To know is not simply to collect more impressions. It is to enter another level of understanding, forsaking the images for the genuine sources. The difference is like abandoning a painted scale that may seem balanced, but actually tilts in favor of a standard that never misleads. You cannot base a life or society on illusions of balance. You need the real thing. And here lies the question that mattered most to Plato. If knowledge is unseen and eternal, what does it mean for human affairs? What happens in law, politics, or morality when you confuse opinion with truth? He warned that whole cities could be built on shadows. A law may sound just, but if it answers only to the shifting will of the powerful, it is nothing more than another reflection. For justice to endure, it would need to be anchored to what is permanent, not to passing appearances. So knowledge, in Plato's view, was not merely an academic puzzle. It served as a defense against corruption. To distinguish shadow from sunlight was the only way to safeguard human life from descending into force without reason. This shift from appearance to truth laid the groundwork for his next concern, the question of justice. Because if knowledge shields you from opinion, then perhaps it can also protect justice itself from being reduced to power. With that, Plato posed one of philosophy's most enduring challenges. What if justice is nothing like the fairness we believe it to be? Plato's question about justice went beyond law courts or fairness in trade. For him, justice signified something more profound than what people usually assume when they hear the word. In the Republic, he argued that most definitions, whether justice as everyone getting what they deserve or justice as the advantage of the stronger, missed its core. If justice were only about rulers securing their own interests, then it would collapse into nothing more than power disguised as principle. Plato rejected that entirely. He wanted justice to be a stable condition, not one that shifts with politics or human desire. Consider how laws typically come about. Those in authority create the rules. On the surface, they seem impartial and carry the weight of enforcement. People follow them, not necessarily because they agree, but because disobedience results in punishment. From this perspective, justice resembles a crooked scale that appears balanced if the correct weight is added. It gives an illusion of fairness while concealing distortion. For Plato, this was a misleading image, an arrangement that might look orderly but remains unjust at its core. To reveal the true nature of justice, he argued that one must look beyond appearances. The route he selected was unconventional. Instead of starting with society, he focused on the soul. His argument was that justice is related to the soul in the same way health is associated with the body. This analogy, outlined in the Republic, immediately clarifies. Just as health involves inner balance and proper functioning among the body's parts, justice involves inner harmony and correct relationships among the soul's parts. The body can seem strong externally while being ill internally. Similarly, a city can appear powerful while remaining unjust if its internal structure has broken down. Plato described both the city and the soul as composed of different elements. A city has its producers, soldiers, and rulers. A single person has appetites, spirit, and reason. Appetites crave food, drink, money, and comfort. Spirit seeks honor, courage, and recognition. Reason aims for truth and wisdom. A healthy life depends on each part performing its own role without overstepping into another. When appetite dominates reason, the soul becomes unbalanced. Likewise, when a class in society oversteps its bounds, the state becomes unstable. Like an unhealthy body, both need restoring to achieve harmony. Justice, then, is precisely this balance. It is the condition where each part of the city or individual fulfills its proper role. Rulers lead, guardians defend, workers provide. Reason governs, spirit obeys its commands, appetite accepts its limits. When this harmony is maintained, there is peace within the soul and stability in the community. It is not fairness in the narrow sense of equitable exchange. It is a holistic state of order. Injustice, by contrast, is the breakdown of this structure, a disease in the body or the state alike. Using the analogy of health clarifies why Plato regarded justice as a higher standard. Laws can be changed, bent, or corrupted. However, the harmony of a just soul or city does not depend on the will of the rulers. It depends on an unchanging form, the form of justice itself. To live justly, whether as an individual or as a whole polis, means participating in this eternal model. Like the form of beauty or goodness, it remains unchanged by circumstances. That permanence is what elevates justice above mere human agreement. Imagine a city in chaos. Workers resent authority, soldiers chase war without direction, rulers pursue wealth instead of wisdom. Outwardly, it may seem impressive, with victories in battle or wealth in abundance. Yet for Plato, it is fundamentally unjust because its order has broken down. The imbalance lies at the heart of its sickness. Healing it requires returning each part to its proper function, just as a doctor restores balance in a patient's body. Without such harmony, no amount of legal reform or punishment could restore justice. This picture challenges our everyday understanding of the term. People often associate justice with outcomes, whether an accused individual receives fair treatment, whether contracts are honored, or whether punishments seem justified. Plato acknowledged these matters, but insisted they belong to a larger pattern. Harmony is the core, with fairness as its expression. A single unjust law cannot dismantle a just city if the overall structure remains balanced and intact, nor can a seemingly fair decision hide injustice if the deeper system is corrupt. The measure is always internal balance, not appearances. Plato emphasized that harmony does not mean equality of roles. He did not ask every citizen or every part of the soul to act alike. He asked each to perform its proper function. In a city, rulers need wisdom, soldiers courage, and workers discipline. In a person, reason must lead, spirit must support, and appetite must follow. Think of an orchestra. Not every instrument plays the same notes or takes the same lead. The justice of the orchestra is not that each musician does identical work, but that each plays the right part at the right time, producing music rather than noise. In the same way, justice lies in orchestrated order. This perspective alters how fairness is perceived. Equal treatment is not abandoned, but it becomes secondary to the integrity of the whole. When rulers serve only themselves, chaos ensues. When soldiers fight for glory instead of duty, they disturb the balance. When desire rules unchecked, the soul or society becomes enslaved to its cravings. Justice restores order among these forces. It focuses less on the fairness of a single act than on the health of the larger system. The fragility of law deepened Plato's concern. History shows that rules can be rewritten by conquerors, manipulated by the wealthy, or ignored by tyrants. If justice relied solely on them, it could never endure. Harmony, on the other hand, is rooted in the very nature of souls and states. It is a condition of survival, not an agreement imposed from above. Just as nobody can withstand prolonged imbalance, no society can remain stable in disorder. Laws may change, but the need for balance remains constant. This model of justice also carried psychological significance. Plato contrasted the philosophical life of order with the tyrannical life driven by unchecked desire. The tyrant seems powerful, able to satisfy every craving. In reality, the tyrant's soul is governed by its lowest part, desire that burns without limit. Because he never finds balance, his life is filled with dissatisfaction, fear, suspicion, and chaos. No matter how much pleasure he secures, it escapes him, leaving him restless. In contrast, the just soul enjoys harmony and true happiness. Courage and wisdom bring stability, desire is kept in check, and spirit earns honor through order. Thus, justice proves not only moral, but also the pathway to genuine well-being. For Plato, that contrast revealed why injustice is inherently destructive. The tyrant might enjoy wealth or dominance, but his life is filled with anxiety and misery. The philosopher may seem less dramatic, but his harmonized soul remains serene. Justice, like health, sustains the body of life. Injustice, like disease, erodes it from within. No mask of power can conceal this truth. Ultimately, an unjust life cannot bring true happiness to anyone. This argument extended justice beyond the individual. It was not limited to rulers or courts. Every person played a part in shaping it by cultivating balance within themselves. Each time reason moderates desire, a little more justice enters the world. Each time spirit values truth over pride, harmony deepens. Therefore, justice is not merely a political idea, but a personal vow. It is a way of being that each soul can nurture or diminish in daily life. Yet the challenge remained. How do you recognize this harmony, especially when cultures fill people's minds with competing values? Plato's answer again pointed to the importance of philosophy in education. A city can only sustain justice if its rulers are trained, not only in practical skills, but in seeing the form of justice itself. Only someone who has turned towards the truth can lead others into balance. Likewise, only a reason guided by knowledge can rule the parts of an individual's soul well. Without this education, any harmony would dissolve back into chaos. Justice, therefore, relies on an ongoing effort of learning and guiding. In summary, justice for Plato was neither a contract among citizens nor a mere mask for power. It was a state of harmony within individuals and societies. It existed when reason led, appetite obeyed, and spirit remained steady. It was a time when rulers governed with integrity, soldiers fought with courage, and citizens worked with discipline. Justice was not just about doing right in small exchanges. It was the very health of the entire system. A city or person lacking it was diseased. With it, both could endure. But even a vision rooted in eternal harmony faced challenges. The Athens of Plato's era still looked to poets for moral guidance, voices that celebrated heroes, gods, and traditions. Their stories shaped public values, sometimes in ways that opposed philosophy's emphasis on reason. To Plato, these voices posed another kind of danger, one not linked to raw power, but capable of misleading communities about the truth. That conflict became his subsequent concern. Why would Plato want to ban poets from his ideal city? To us, that suggestion feels drastic. Poets narrated the stories that were the essence of Greek culture. They sang of gods, wars, heroes, and victories. They preserved traditions that shaped how people thought about honor and morality. Removing them seems almost like erasing memory itself. Yet Plato believed that this removal was not only sensible, but also necessary. That is because, in his judgment, poets held a power over the mind stronger than most realized, and if left unchecked, that power could distort society itself. In ancient Greece, poetry was more than just entertainment. It served as the primary means of conveying education, religion, and communal history. Where philosophy later sought to explain these ideas through argument, poetry had already shaped them with verse. Children listened to tales of gods at festivals, citizens watched heroic deeds on stage, and entire communities absorbed their values, not through reason, but through performance. In this way, the poet's voice functioned almost like the city's classroom. It taught through rhythm, beauty, and storytelling. Because of this pivotal role, it became a double-edged sword, influential and persuasive, but not necessarily truthful. Long before Plato, the philosopher Xenophanes had already criticized Homer and Hesiod for corrupting the divine image, saying they attributed to the gods everything that is a shame and reproach among humans, to steal, commit adultery, and deceive one another. Plato inherited this suspicion. For him, the danger was not that poets were insignificant, but that they were so central to moral education. The core of the problem was imitation, what the Greeks called mimesis. In Book 3 of the Republic, Plato described mimesis as impersonation, a person adopting another's voice, as an actor does when speaking lines in character. He worried this encouraged people to absorb behavior without reflection, copying ways of feeling and acting rather than developing discipline. By Book X, his critique became more profound. There, mimesis was not just taking on another voice, but imitating appearances themselves. Poets and painters did not represent things as they are, but only as they seem, creating works that were mere reproductions. This shift in meaning revealed how, for Plato, the issue ran deeper than stage performance. The poetic image was not only imitation of a style, it was imitation of imitation, several steps removed from truth. To clarify this danger, Plato used a vivid analogy. Imagine a carpenter making a table. The carpenter shapes wood into something useful. His work, though imperfect, is a direct reflection of the form of the table, the universal standard of what a table is. The philosopher, in pursuit of forms, works one step higher, seeking that universal model. But the painter or the poet simply imitates the surface. A painting of a table isn't furniture, it is colors arranged on a surface. Plato illustrated this with what he called the mirror simile. If you wanted, you could take a mirror and instantly create anything, the earth, the heavens, houses, people, simply by reflecting them. Yet nothing in the mirror is real, it is only an image. Similarly, poetry might seem like wisdom, but it is merely a surface reflection. It is attractive yet hollow, a copy of a copy, distant from truth. Here lies the core of Plato's concern. He had already described knowledge as a journey beyond the visible into the eternal forms. Poetry pulled listeners back into shadows, keeping them at the level of emotion and appearance. Instead of guiding reason, it stoked passions, anger, grief, lust, and fear. These emotions seized control of the soul when poetry was at its strongest. For justice to exist, reason had to govern, but poetry promoted the opposite, stirring appetites and emotions while sidestepping rational analysis. Imagine this in practice. a society strives to nurture disciplined citizens with rulers guided by wisdom and spirits trained to follow reason. Yet night after night, those same citizens watch stories where gods behave like jealous rivals, heroes pursue glory through cruelty, or tricksters achieve success through lies. Because these scenes are vivid and compelling, audiences accept them almost without question. They start to believe that to be honored is to compete like the gods, that to be heroic is to seek glory at any cost, or that cunning triumphs over justice. These lessons are not delivered as arguments, but are impressions deeply imprinted through rhythm and image. For Plato, that educational power made poetry perilous for both individual souls and the very balance of the city. Tragedy was a serious concern. Its stories encouraged pity for weakness, fear of harm, and grief at loss. Plato feared that such emotions, when indulged regularly, would train the soul to surrender to them rather than regulate them. Comedy presented a different threat. By mocking flaws and ridiculing vices, it cultivated habits of laughter at vice, reinforcing the appetite for entertainment rather than discipline. Both, he argued, distracted the soul by feeding its emotional parts instead of strengthening its rational core. If justice required reason to lead, then art that taught passion to rule was a teacher of injustice. You might object here. Doesn't poetry also inspire noble feelings like courage, loyalty, or wonder? Plato acknowledged that poetry could uplift. However, his belief was that poetic inspiration was unreliable. It could just as easily glorify vice as celebrate virtue. Since its method was to persuade through feeling rather than facts, it had no inherent safeguard against error. To give poets leadership in moral education was like letting chance rule a city's laws. Philosophy, by contrast, though less thrilling, was grounded in reasoning, aiming at what is constant. To Plato, the choice was clear. The city should rely on rational guidance rather than the excitement of stirring words. His suspicion becomes clearer when you recall the painter analogy once more. A person can look at a painted table and admire it, yet forget it cannot bear weight or hold food. Likewise, people might be moved by poetry's depictions of bravery or tragedy, but forget that these are merely images, rearranged appearances. The mirror simile captures this effectively. Just by lifting a mirror, you can seem to hold up the entire world in reflection. It looks full, but nothing has substance. Art, he warned, is like that mirror, convincing, vivid, but offering only illusions instead of realities. So Plato's proposal to ban poets was not motivated by disdain for art itself. It was a protective measure. He regarded poetry as too dangerous to be left unchecked in a city committed to truth. Citizens who draw values from verse risk mistaking appearance for reality. They would be guided by images rather than reason. For him, this was corruption at its foundation, an unraveling of harmony. Poetry might still be allowed in his city, but only under strict regulations. It must support reason and promote virtue, not undermine them. Otherwise, it would be better to remove it entirely. This judgment raises an urgent issue. Is truth truly so fragile that words and stories can unsettle it? Plato believed it was, at least for those living at the level of opinion. The senses and the culture built upon them provided ever-changing reflections. Without discipline, people confuse impressions with knowledge. Philosophy's task was to train the mind to see beyond them. Poetry, when unrestrained, pulled people back toward illusion. That tension has never gone away. Today, many value poetry and art precisely for their ability to express emotion, expand imagination, and enrich human life. Plato recognized this too. However, his criticism was directed at their unchecked power in shaping ideas of truth. Words can shine with beauty while distorting reality. Stories can lend splendor to injustice or glamour to cruelty. The very fact that they inspire proves their power, and that power, unless carefully directed, could lead whole societies into confusion. Seen in this light, his critique of art aligns neatly with his broader view of justice. Harmony relies on reason controlling appetite and spirit. Poetry, by elevating passion above reason, reverses that order. Left unchecked, it trains citizens to indulge rather than discipline, destabilizing both souls and communities. Allowing poets unlimited influence was like permitting appetite to become king of the soul, or emotion to override law. What stands out is that Plato did not dismiss poetry as trivial. He recognized its importance. His call to exclude poets acknowledged their influence. He feared them because their words could alter values and shape society. His ban was not careless censorship, but a deliberate defense. Remove the source of danger before it destabilizes the foundation. Whether he was fair to the poets remains a matter of debate to this day. Some argue he overstated the danger, asserting that art can convey truth through symbol and narrative. Others claim his caution was justified, noting how mass culture can manipulate values as easily as inspire virtue. But regardless of your position, his suspicion of poetry shows how fragile he believed human knowledge could be. Illusion was always nearby, and appearances could easily deceive the mind away from reality. And here, a new question arose. If poetry itself could be criticized for offering only imitations, critics soon questioned whether Plato's own solution, the forms, might face a similar flaw. If appearances can deceive by necessitating endless copies, what occurs when his theory of eternal forms is subjected to the same reasoning? At that point, the challenge turned inward, and Plato confronted an unsettling test of his own central concept. What followed was a challenge with sharp edges, the third man argument. It was directed straight at the heart of Plato's theory of forms. Instead of attacking it from outside, this argument operated from within the system itself, pushing on the very logic that was supposed to hold it together. If successful, it would not only weaken forms, but also risk demonstrating that the idea could never function as the stable foundation of knowledge Plato asserted. Here is how the problem was set up. Start with something simple. Many large objects exist. Plato responds that they are all large because they participate in the form of largeness. The form explains the shared property. But critics asked, if the form of largeness is what makes each large thing large, then is the form itself also large? If it is, doesn't it belong in the group with the other large things? And if that is so, then another form must be invoked to explain the similarity between the first form and the things it makes large. That would be a new largeness over both. But once that new form is included, the same question arises again, requiring yet another form to account for the similarity. The process continues endlessly. Every time the form is grouped with others, another form is required above it. This is why philosophers spoke of a third man. First, there are individual men. Second, there is the form of man. But if the form is regarded as one more man, then a third form is needed to explain what unites the other two. Soon, a fourth is required, then a fifth, creating an infinite chain. The regress stretches endlessly, with each new form demanding another beyond it. The image of two mirrors facing each other illustrates the trap. Hold them up, and your reflection is endlessly repeated, stretching into the distance with no final image. Similarly, the third man posed a threat to Plato's idea of infinite multiplication. The real danger was not just the number of forms, but what this did to their very purpose. Each form was supposed to be a single, stable explanation, a definitive foundation, so that knowledge wouldn't dissolve into flux. If the forms themselves lead to an endless series, then they fail in this task. Instead of providing stability, they become part of the instability they were meant to resolve. That is why philosophers have called the third man a vicious regress. It undermines the purpose of the theory itself. Imagine yourself in Plato's position. You claim that for every set of objects or qualities, there is a single proper form, a universal model that explains them all. You incorporate this idea into your theories of knowledge, justice, beauty, and even reality itself. Then a critic asks, but doesn't your form also belong to the very group it aims to explain? If so, you no longer have a single explanation. You have an endless chain. This reveals cracks in your foundation. Plato appears to have taken this difficulty seriously. In his later dialogues, we observe him grappling with it, refining his descriptions of forms and sharpening distinctions. He did not offer a simple dismissal, but he introduced adjustments that, within his system, enabled him to progress with confidence. These refinements concentrated on clarifying how forms relate to themselves and to the particulars that participate in them. A first move was to insist that forms are not just one more item among the objects they explain. Unlike particular things, which can be larger or smaller, more or less beautiful, the form of the large is not another large body. It is what largeness itself signifies. In our mirror analogy, it is not simply one more reflection. It is the standard that makes reflection possible at all. By elevating forms to a different level of being, Plato aimed to distinguish them from the chain of particulars and prevent the regress from commencing. An even more significant distinction was another one that later interpreters have emphasized as key to resolving the issue. Plato distinguished between predication in relation to itself, pros he auto, and predication in relation to others, pros ta alia. To say the large is large does not imply that the form is large in the same way as a boulder or a giant is large. Instead, the statement is true in a different sense, what scholars sometimes describe as an essential or pure predication. It characterizes the form's very nature, not an ordinary property it happens to share. That distinction is essential. Once you understand it, the regress slows down. The form isn't just one more large thing grouped with others. It is largeness itself. Asking for another form to explain its similarity would be a mistake in categorization. Ordinary objects appear prominent because they exhibit a particular feature. The form is large because it embodies the very concept of largeness. It doesn't need an additional explanation beyond itself. In this way, Plato's metaphysics can say goodbye to the third man. Another refinement involved emphasizing the language of participation rather than likeness. If the form is simply like the objects, then indeed both require a further explanation of their similarity. But if the objects participate in the form, the relation shifts. Participation indicates dependence. A shadow depends on the body that casts it, but you do not need something further to explain why both seem similar. By describing particulars as participating in forms, Plato clarified that the two do not stand on the same level at all. The form is original, the particular is derivative. This distinction helps prevent the infinite regress before it begins. Even with these refinements, later thinkers, such as Aristotle, revisited the problem, arguing that Plato's solutions were more about rephrasing words than providing a definitive answer. However, what matters is that Plato himself did not see the third man as unavoidable. He addressed it by re-examining how language functions when used to describe forms. By recognizing different kinds of predication and by distinguishing the specific level of reality that the forms occupy, he safeguarded the system from failure. The distinction between pros hiauto and pros ta alia may seem technical, but it allowed his theory to endure. The form defines the property without being simply one of the things that share it. This moment marked a shift in tone. Early on, the world of the forms shone brightly and simply. Later, Plato appeared more cautious, more nuanced, aware of the pitfalls that logic could create. For him, philosophy was not the delivery of final answers, but an ongoing process of adjustment shaped by arguments that tested the core ideas. The third man did not dismantle the theory. It compelled it to become more precise, emphasizing differences he had previously left implicit. And this, for you as a listener, reveals something broader. Powerful ideas are always vulnerable to the weight of questioning. What keeps a system alive is not its immunity from criticism, but its ability to bend under pressure without snapping. Plato's rethinking of predication, participation, and levels of being demonstrates that lesson in action. By stretching the theory, he preserved it. Yet progress always opens new doors. By drawing a clearer line between truth and appearance, Plato secured the stability of forms. However, this clarification raised another question. If the forms are defined by what truly exists, how can we understand what does not? Every error, every lie, every false belief seems to say something about what is not. But how can humans speak or think of nothing at all? That question set the stage for his subsequent great inquiry, the Puzzle of Falsehood. Can falsehood exist at all? To you and me, the answer feels obvious. People make mistakes, lies are told, illusions appear. But once Plato had tied truth so closely to eternal, unchanging forms, error became a more profound riddle. If truth belongs to what is, then what could untruth possibly refer to? How can language point towards something that is not there? Many philosophers before him had already stumbled on this very puzzle, arguing that it makes no sense to say of something that it is something which it is not. To claim as much, they thought, was nonsense. You cannot meaningfully speak of nothing. Yet falsehood persisted in real life. So the challenge was sharp. How do you explain lies or errors without giving reality to nothing? Plato clarified the problem by demonstrating how truth operates. Every form is an eternal truth. The form of a triangle does not waver. It is always a figure with three sides. The form of beauty or justice remains fixed in eternity. When you state, a triangle has three sides, you speak in accordance with the form itself. There is no complication here. Truth remains steadfast, but change the words slightly. A triangle has four sides. At first glance, this sentence appears to describe nothing at all. The triangle with four sides does not exist. So, how can a false statement still be considered a statement? Doesn't it collapse into meaninglessness the moment you utter it? This is where the puzzle becomes most challenging. If non-being is merely absence, then any claim about it falls apart. Falsehood would then be impossible. However, we know that errors do occur. Someone might incorrectly state that 2 + 2 = 5, or believe that a shadow is a body. The human mind can produce and understand falsehoods. Therefore, the task for Plato was to explain how falsehoods can be possible without treating them as contact with nothing itself. Consider pointing at a shadow and declaring it solid. The eye perceives a form, the hand finds nothing. Falsehood resembles this. It seems to refer to something, but what it refers to does not align with reality. Some of Plato's contemporaries saw this as proof that falsehoods could not logically exist at all if they seemingly refer to nothing. They vanish as soon as reason examines them. Yet, plainly, people continue to be deceived, confused, or misled. Denying the existence of falsehood does not make the phenomenon disappear. It only leaves it unexplained. Plato addressed this issue directly in the dialogue called The Sophist. Instead of denying falsehood, he examined how philosophers had been defining non-being. What if non-being is not simply nothingness? What if it is instead a relative concept, meaning not absolute absence, but difference? This was his crucial move. He argued that the nature of not being is part of the difference. That is, non-being exists as a difference from what is in a certain way, in a certain respect. Once you understand it this way, falsehood becomes possible. To lie is not to speak of nothing. It is to confuse differences through misattribution. Think of misnaming a horse as a cow. The statement is false, but it is not mere empty noise. Both horses and cows exist. The error is in claiming that the horse, that it is what it is not. At Sophist 263b, Plato makes this clear. Falsehood states something other than whatever is in relation to a given subject that it is. The mistake is not the invention of nothing, but the mislabeling of identities. A false statement is speech that wrongly confuses one being with another, replacing difference with sameness. This precision matters. Truth is alignment. Calling a horse. Falsehood is misalignment, labeling something as something it is not. Notice the balance here. Plato's solution allows falsehood to exist as a meaningful act of speech. Lies, misunderstandings, or illusions become miscombinations of difference, not mere attempts to speak about absence. Falsehood has its place. It explains human mistakes without undermining the idea that truth depends on what is real. Now consider everyday examples. Someone says, "I left the room," while still standing inside it. The words are coherent. You can map out each part: the person, the action, the place. The mistake comes from linking the subject with an action that does not apply. It shows a difference in the clothes of the same kind. In this way, Plato maintains the meaningfulness of language while allowing for its potential errors. The shift from non-being as nothing to non-being as difference may seem straightforward, but it carries significant weight. It maintains the clarity of forms as unchanging truths while elucidating why error persists. Shadows, lies, and illusions derive their significance from resembling real forms but confusing their differences. The shadow appears like a body. The outright lie resembles a potential fact. Falsehood structures itself on what is, even as it distorts it. This explanation also clarifies why Plato distrusted poetry. Earlier, he had warned that poets rely too heavily on imitation. With his discussion of falsehood, he could add that much of poetry's power comes from blurring categories. Gods are depicted as quarreling mortals, while mortals are portrayed as gods. Appearances are mistaken for realities. Each vivid phrase creates an illusion with meaning, but the meaning is false because it confuses differences. For Plato, this made poetry not only emotionally deceptive, but also logically false. The The change of terms also broadens philosophy's role. Philosophers are not merely seekers of truth, they are protectors against confusion. Whenever you think or speak, you connect elements. You risk misconnecting them. The role of philosophy is to identify how this confusion occurs and to correct it. By demonstrating that falsehood results from mistaking difference for sameness, Plato precisely indicates where error arises. It is akin to a craftsman examining a pattern. The design is flawless, but the copies may misalign lines or colors. The goal is not to erase craftsmanship, but to identify faults and improve skills. Similarly, with thought, it may misplace categories, but by recognizing where differences emerge, it can adapt and regain alignment. And this strengthened Plato's theory. Instead of dismissing lies, he incorporated them into a world founded on forms. Falsehood became an understandable mistake, a structured misidentification. Speech always conveys content, but that content may fail to correspond with reality if differences are concealed. You can now explain errors without treating nothing as something, and without denying the simple fact that people lie and make mistakes. To me, the elegance is evident. Plato avoided two impossible extremes, that falsehood is simply nonsense, or that nothing exists. By redefining non-being as difference, he managed to include human life, where mistakes are constant within his grand scheme. Truth still resides in the eternal. Falsehood emerges as the distortions humans produce when they blur categories. Both become understandable within a single framework. But this solution also broadens our perspective. Once falsehood is clarified, philosophy can extend from the truth itself to the conditions of human life. We are not always in harmony with eternal forms. We stumble, confuse, or mislead. Falsehood is part of how limited beings engage with infinite truths. Therefore, philosophy aims not only to reveal reality, but also to navigate the errors that accompany it. And so we reach another tension. Once you recognize how easily people fall into error, another question arises. When guiding life, should we trust what feels good or what helps us understand? Everyday life offers both pleasure and insight, but they do not always point in the same direction. Which should take precedence? Pleasure and knowledge are contrasted in one of Plato's later works, the Philebus, as if in a contest. Each claims to be the better guide for human life. Pleasure is obvious, immediate, and rooted in the body. Everyone recognizes its pull. You eat ripe fruit, you laugh, you warm yourself in the sun. Knowledge, by contrast, seems slower. It requires patience, discipline, and often struggle. Yet once attained, it endures, persisting in memory, teaching, and shaping lives beyond your own. The dialogue straightforwardly asks, which of these deserves to shape the good life? This framing represented a shift from Plato's earlier ideas. In the Phaedo, he portrayed pleasure as a burden, almost a weight that the body drags the soul down with. Philosophers in that dialogue were encouraged to free themselves from bodily pleasures so the soul could ascend towards truth. However, in the Philebus, pleasure is considered more carefully. It is not outright dismissed as a barrier. Instead, Plato examines the role it must have alongside intelligence, acknowledging that no view of human life is complete without considering it. Imagine two lives. One experiences every pleasure, music, food, intimacy, laughter, but lacks understanding of why things happen, foresight, or reason. The other is the opposite, complete intelligence, pure access to truth, but no joy or sense of delight. Would either of these truly qualify as a good life? Plato insists they would not. Remove one aspect and both become distorted. A life of pleasure alone resembles grazing animals, responsive but without purpose. A life of knowledge without pleasure feels drained, cold, and hardly human. To explain why, Plato provides one of his most precise accounts of what pleasure is. At Philebus 32b, he defines it as the state of disturbance and restoration. When the natural harmony of a living being is disrupted, that disruption is pain, and when it returns to its proper balance, that restoration is pleasure. Hunger, thirst, exhaustion, these disturb the body. Food, drink, rest, these restore it. Pleasure, then, is not an inherent good, but a sign of recovery, a movement back towards stability. This makes pleasure secondary. It depends on the lack and repair. Knowledge, by contrast, does not hinge on damage or need. Arithmetic remains true whether you are hungry or full. Proportion is stable without reference to harm. Plato then classifies pleasures. Some are mixed with pain, depending on its presence. Scratching an itch, drinking when thirsty, eating after a fast. These pleasures are linked to previous suffering. Such experiences reveal the dependent nature of much of what we call joy. They serve as a form of relief. Other pleasures, like experiencing beauty, calm, or harmony, seem purer, not tied to apparent pain. Here, at least, pleasure occupies a higher position, appearing closer to constancy. However, even at its best, it still seems more like an accessory than a foundation. He presses further, distinguishing between genuine and false pleasures. This is one of his most notable moves in the dialogue. False pleasures appear in many forms. Some are what scholars later called Esau's pleasures, desires for things that are overrated or misvalued, as if trading your deeper good for a fleeting satisfaction. Others are the dairymaid's pleasures, which stem not from the present, but from anticipation. A person imagines bright prospects or calming visions, enjoying the joy that comes with what they believe will happen. But when the event actually occurs, it may disappoint. At Philebus 38-39b, Plato comments on these false expectations. The pleasure experienced was absolute, but the belief was mistaken. The joy derived from a picture that did not match reality. Therefore, even pleasure can deceive, offering a lure in anticipation that vanishes when the truth is realized. This leads to an even sharper contrast. Plato describes a third condition besides pleasure and pain, a state of undisturbed integrity, where the soul remains unaffected by disturbance or the relief that follows. At 33b, he calls this the most godlike state. It involves resting in balance beyond the fluctuations of need and satisfaction. Human beings cannot live entirely in this state, but it reveals that even pleasure is merely a remedial good. Pleasure appears when we are restored after loss. However, the highest life, if we could attain it, would transcend such fluctuations, remaining steady, undisturbed, and harmonious. How should the good life then be conceived? In Philebus, Plato resolves the debate not by choosing one element over another in isolation, but by creating a mixture. This mixture produces the best life, with knowledge taking the lead. Pleasure, though essential, joins as a companion only when properly ordered. Mindlessly pursuing pleasure results in confusion and decay. Knowledge without pleasure drains life of its vibrancy. The key is the blend, but its worth depends on the proportion. Consider cultivation. Bite into a sweet fruit. Pleasure touches you instantly, but the taste fades, and soon you seek another. Now imagine sowing fields, tending to the soil, and observing the seasons. This is knowledge, more demanding work, slower to reward. but it yields a harvest enough to endure, nourishing many and not just yourself. The Philebus asserts that the good life should be structured like this: grounded in wisdom, brightened by pleasure, balanced in proportion, never leaning entirely to one side. Plato makes it clear that not all knowledge holds the same value. Some forms are mundane, such as counting footsteps or observing surfaces. Others ascend higher, such as understanding harmony, order, justice, and the good itself. It is this highest form of intelligence, centered on the forms, that rightly deserves to be recognized as the leader. Pleasures then serve as adornments and supports, keeping life human and joyful, but they do not define its true purpose. You can see how this connects with his earlier concerns about poetry. Poets stirred emotions and often confused appearances with reality, allowing pleasure to run unchecked. That was philosophy's danger, surrendering to feeling without reason in control. But here, Plato permits that, when balanced, pleasures can enrich life. Under the guidance of reason, their color and brightness can offset the coldness of knowledge. It's not about stripping life bare. It's about letting reason take the lead while pleasure accompanies the journey. The analogy of music captures this harmony. Instruments each produce sounds that please the ear. On their own, the tones are fragmented delights. Under rhythm and order, they combine, creating a symphony. The orchestra displays justice, not each member acting the same, but each playing its proper part. In the same way, intelligence is the rhythm and measure that makes pleasures part of an ordered life, rather than scattered indulgences. Plato concludes the Philebus with an impressive ranking of goods, establishing the order he believes is essential for the good life. At the top, he places measure and proportion, the principle of limit that underpins all order. Second are the harmonious mixtures that conform to this limit. Third is reason and intelligence, the driving force behind this structured living. Fourth are the properties of the soul itself. And finally, fifth, are authentic and pure pleasures. Notice where pleasure is positioned, not dismissed, but clearly subordinate to proportion, harmony, and reason. It belongs to the good life, but only in proper order, never at the summit. For Plato, this reflected the human condition. We cannot eliminate pleasures, nor should we let them dominate. The best life is one of balance, guided by wisdom, maintained by moderation, colored by joy, but never overtaken by desire. If in the Phaedo pleasure was merely the soul's burden, here in the Philebus it appears as a partner, limited, ordered, accepted, but not supreme. Knowledge still guides, but pleasure earns its place, not as ruler, but as companion. This resolution, however, carried implications beyond the individual soul. If harmony was the hallmark of the best life for one person, what did that imply for the life of a city? If proportion and balance mattered for joy and reason within, might they also matter in politics and law without? Plato's focus was shifting. The contest between pleasure and knowledge within the soul laid the groundwork for his reflections on order in the state. It is here, in his later works, that his vision of politics itself began to evolve. Why did Plato, in his final years, start to doubt the philosopher king? For much of his earlier life, this figure had been central to his utopia, an ideal ruler who combined knowledge of truth with the courage to govern, and who remained uncorrupted by wealth or ambition. This was not merely a political leader, but a guardian of justice, possessing vision above illusion and immune to the temptations that lead ordinary rulers astray. but the world around him provided no evidence that such a ruler could ever come to power. Instead, Athens and the wider Greek world revealed a landscape of instability and corruption, so he changed his approach. He did not abandon wisdom as the guiding principle, but searched for new foundations to support it. The distinction between dream and reality grew sharper over time. In works like The Republic, he could envisage politics guided entirely by philosophy. However, in reality, he observed ambition, petty rivalries, and endless wars. Cities fell, leaders betrayed their people, and fragile alliances disintegrated. The harmony he desired did not materialize. Confronted with this disparity, he became pragmatic. He came to believe that no perfect guardian could uphold order on their own, so he shifted his focus to laws and institutions. These were to undertake the task his ideal ruler could not practically fulfill. You might consider it as architecture. A blueprint on paper can appear perfect. Arches, pillars, balance everywhere. But if the ground beneath is unstable, the construction warps and cracks. The philosopher king was that blueprint, elegant in theory, but unsupported by the soil of human behavior. Greek politics offered shifting sands, not firm ground. Without a stable foundation for his ideal, the palace remained a sketch. Watching design after design fail around him, Plato began to sketch a stronger framework. He found it in law. A law, once written, has endurance. It survives the death of leaders, outlasts ambition, and counters appetite. Institutions built around laws provide continuity where single personalities falter. They might not match the philosophical radiance of a ruler guided by reason alone, but they prevent collapse under the weight of desire and power. Plato scaled down his original hopes. The question was no longer how to find a flawless leader, but how to design a structure in which even imperfect rulers could not steer entirely into chaos. This new focus still reflected his lifelong concern with harmony. Achieving balance within the soul, reason ruling spirit and appetite, was challenging enough for individuals. Expecting an entire state to remain united under one perfect ruler was even more difficult. Laws, he believed, could act like weights in a scale, preventing excess by stabilizing extremes. They embodied, in political life, the same principle he had celebrated in the Philebus: measure and proportion, paris, as the foundation of goodness and order. The turn was not away from philosophy, but towards embedding its insights into enduring forms. Laws became instruments of balance, existing outside the character of any one ruler, while still bearing the imprint of reason. Plato's disillusionment with politics explains this shift. Time revealed to him that philosophers seldom gained power, and those who did wield authority often did not care for truth. He could not wait for circumstances to bring about the right ruler, so he rethought politics to endure flawed ones. His later dialogues describe laws as protective walls, shielding the city from collapse even without a perfect guardian. Think of law as scaffolding. You might wish the structure stood entirely on its elegant design, yet storms, shifting soil, and wear demand supporting frames. In Statesman, Plato described laws as imitations of truth, practical stand-ins that echo, as far as possible, the insight of a genuine statesman armed with politique episteme, actual political knowledge. Since that ideal was almost beyond reach, laws had to function as a second best, holding together what circumstances could not provide. For Plato, in his age, this was a compromise, was nothing like resignation, a tall extension of his pursuit of order. He still kept the ideal alive. The philosopher king remained a beacon. But beneath that star, cities must walk with lamps. Laws became those lamps, guiding rulers and citizens in the dark even if they lacked perfect vision. Instead of demanding pure wisdom to descend into history, he sought ways to embed wisdom into repeatable patterns of governance. There was a sense of maturity in this adjustment. Youth had envisioned gleaming forms, ideals untouched by compromise. Experience revealed cracks in every structure built by human hands. He now asked less of politics, not perfection, but a tendency towards balance. A city flawed, yet striving for order seemed better than a perfect plan too fragile to survive. Laws, councils, and institutions, though they lacked brilliance, provided stability. A single guardian might rise and fall, but a legal framework could endure. The ethical implications of this change are crucial. If justice is harmony, then a city can achieve justice even without perfect leaders, as long as its laws keep balance. Plato viewed law as a guide for moderation, capable of restraining desires and encouraging rulers to cooperate. In his later works, he explained punishment not as revenge, but as a form of medicine. At Laws 860d, he noted that no one is evil willingly. Offenses come from ignorance, weakness, or disorder within the soul. Therefore, punishment should heal. The law treats injustice as a disease, using correction to restore harmony. This connected legislation directly with eudaimonia, human flourishing. Law was not just control, it was therapy for the soul, aiming at the same health that Plato had earlier described within individuals. By shifting focus, Plato made politics more resilient. Early ideas depended on the chance of finding a philosopher king. Later ideas endured flaws and setbacks, perhaps less grand, but more practical. This difference is what gave his later politics their significance, still rooted in philosophy, but adapted to the complexities of history. Does that mean the Republic became irrelevant? Hardly. It remained a guiding star, offering an image of perfected harmony. But Plato's later works accepted that no society could realize it fully. Instead, they asked, how close can we get through law and measure? How can institutions encourage citizens towards balance, even in imperfect conditions? The shift was not surrender, but refinement, bridging dream and footprint. You can see it as light shining on two levels. The philosopher king shines from a height, symbolizing the ultimate union of wisdom and power. Laws operate nearer to the ground, steady and practical, holding daily life together. Both are part of the whole, offering two ways in which philosophy touches reality, through the unreachable ideal and the workable structure. The Laws, Plato's final and most extensive work, best illustrates this integration. It describes a city maintained not by the enlightenment of a single ruler, but by a system of institutions. Nonetheless, the Nocturnal Council, one of its key features, reveals continuity with the metaphysics of forms. Here, select rulers are educated to explore the problem of the one and the many, to seek one form among many diverse instances, and to understand how virtues are both distinct and unified. The curriculum reflects the very concerns that initiated his philosophy. Even at the level of law, the focus on forms subtly endures. The ideal never disappears. It remains embedded within institutional design. Seen this way, Plato's politics is not about rejecting the forms, but about translating them into human time. Laws and institutions include philosophy as much as possible, turning eternal standards into civic orders. They replace stars with scaffolding, not because laws surpass wisdom, but because they stabilize human life until wisdom can shed its light. Politics becomes a second best, but also a bridge, maintaining harmony where pure philosophy is too fragile to govern directly. What holds all of this together is continuity with his broader system. From the Phaedo to the Philebus, he taught that measure and proportion define what is good. Just as pleasure must be balanced by reason and appetite guided by intellect, politics must also balance power with law. The same vision of harmony pervades both soul and city alike. With age, the balance leaned more towards practicality, but the guiding principle remained unchanged. So, why did Plato modify his politics? Because he realized that although wisdom is the rightful ruler, history seldom allows it. Laws had to take its place, restraining chaos and guiding citizens towards harmony. The philosopher king remained the guiding star, but cities needed lamps on the way. With this balance, ideal above, laws below, Plato completed his system, integrating soul, truth, justice, and politics into a unified design. Yet this left one pressing question. What happens when ideals of eternity meet the struggles of real society? Is the bridge sturdy, or do cracks appear where the two worlds strain against each other? Plato's philosophy reached its sharpest tension where two realms stood opposed. On one side, he insisted on the eternal, the stable, unchanging world of forms. On the other hand, he confronted the visible, governments, desires, and shifting lives. He never abandoned the distinction between these two orders of existence. But the struggle that defined his entire project was always the same. How do they interact? A person cannot live purely in the eternal, yet to live only in the visible is to lose truth. Philosophy for him meant holding both at once, refusing to let permanence vanish or to let daily life float anchorless. This collision of worlds became the question that permeated all of his thoughts. The basic outline sounds straightforward. There are two planes of reality, the invisible, where eternal truths exist, and the visible, where change and flux shape experience. But the simplicity disappears the moment you ask how they intersect. Human beings cannot ascend into eternity to dwell with the forms. They eat, work, argue, and struggle. Yet if they only live within those circles, blind to what is timeless, they lose meaning. Philosophy is the effort to connect them, to allow eternity to guide life without pretending that life itself is free from instability. That meeting point was the center of Plato's thought. Think of it as a building site where an impeccable plan meets rough material. The architect sketches smooth arches, exact measurements, and correct proportions. But as masons carve stone, cracks appear, weights shift, and limits resist. The drawing represents the perfect forms, the raw stone, the material world. It is only when the two meet that a structure stands. The Timaeus enhanced this analogy. Plato imagined the divine demiurge shaping the cosmos, compelled to work with the material available. The design aims for perfection, but the medium resists. The same image applies to his later politics in the laws. There, as the lawgiver, he had to do the same. Use the materials of contemporary institutions, diverse colonists, and flawed characters to craft the best order possible. Eternity and time press against each other. Their clash is what makes a city stand. This pattern permeated every aspect of his system. In love, desire for individual bodies lifted the soul towards beauty itself. The body fades, the form persists. The task of philosophy was to allow lived desire to be guided by eternal beauty without forgetting the fragility of mortal attraction. Both dimensions were real, and their unease defined what love meant. Knowledge faces the same conflict. Senses offer endless, shifting impressions. Reason seeks consistent truth. But to live, humans must rely on their senses. You cannot abandon them. You can only train thought to rise above them. Education becomes the bridge, beginning with appearances, but not stopping there. The struggle is what makes the process challenging. It requires turning away from what is familiar to what resists. You cannot stay solely with the forms, nor sink only into images. Knowledge arises where they meet. Justice, as he described it in the Republic, exposed the conflict on a societal level. The form of justice was pure harmony. However, real cities were driven by desire, conflict, and ambition. To establish eternal order, Plato created a model where rulers, soldiers, and workers represented reason, spirit, and appetite. It became his blueprint for society, yet even he recognized that history offered no examples. The clear lines of justice clashed with messy human desire, and the two rarely coincided. That was the clash in social structure. The critique of poetry revealed the divide further. Poetry communicates through images, stirs emotions, and attracts crowds with passion. Philosophy seeks truth, free from illusions. Both are vital to a culture, yet they are difficult to reconcile. His response was strict: ban poetry unless it conformed to reason. However, even this ban highlighted the tension. Society desires storytelling. Philosophy demands clarity. In Plato's city, one must submit. The clash leaves no simple harmony. The third man argument approached him from a different perspective. If every group of things participates in a form, and the form itself appears like another member of that group, the series leads to an infinite regress. Plato's response was to draw a clearer distinction. He modified his idea to suggest that forms exist on a higher level of being than their particulars. They are not like the things they explain, but belong to a completely separate plane. Particulars depend on forms, not the other way around. This is why he replaced the concept of likeness with participation. The clash here led to refinement. Instead of undermining his vision, it made the eternal more precise, more secure, and distinct from the particulars it organizes. The Puzzle of Falsehood revealed the same pattern. If only truth belongs to the eternal, where does error originate? Lies are part of life, but how can they mean anything if they describe what is not? In The Sophist, he confronted the puzzle directly. His solution was to redefine non-being, not as nothing, but as difference. A false statement is not meaningless noise about pure absence. It is a misplacement of identity, one thing spoken of as if it were another. Falsehood becomes confusions of difference, meaningful but wrong. Once again, the eternal provided the anchor, but its clash with daily speech necessitated a new definition. This shift did not break the system. Instead, it deepened it, showing how error can exist without making nothing real. The Philebus revisited the contest between body and mind. On one side, pleasure, immediate and persuasive. On the other, knowledge, demanding but constant. Neither alone, he argued, makes the good life. However, the mixture requires prioritization. Harmony was achieved only when knowledge was empowered to guide. Pleasure retained its space, but not its authority. This reflects the logic of proportion and balance, the same order he had supported elsewhere. Eternity belongs to stable measure. Life calls for color and delight. The two must blend, but intellect must always be in command. The conflict was not an equal compromise. It became a patterned settlement. Later, politics demanded the hardest concession. The philosopher king had been the beacon. a ruler entirely guided by truth. However, history revealed that rulers rarely matched that ideal. Plato turned to laws and institutions, practical measures designed to outlast individuals. He recognized the limits of history and the fragility of human character. Laws acted like lamps illuminating the way. The king remained like a star high above. The beacon still guided, but the lamp steadied the steps below. It was not retreat, but adaptation born from the clash of dream and circumstance. Philosophy was compelled to rest on scaffolding, yet it still carried the vast proportions of eternity within its framework. Stepping back, Plato's entire journey becomes a map of this two-world struggle. Love lifted desire upwards while anchoring it in bodies. Knowledge sought permanence while engaging with sense. Justice established an eternal plan against civic disputes. Poetry exposed a longing for stories versus the call of truth. The third-man argument challenged the status of the eternal itself, refining its structure. Falsehood necessitated redefining non-being. Pleasure and knowledge clashed, ultimately blending within a hierarchy of parts. Politics extended beyond philosophy to laws suited to human frailty. Each theme posed the same question: not which world to reject, but how to connect them. What is remarkable is that Plato never abandoned the effort. He could have retreated solely into theory, dismissing practical life. He could have surrendered philosophy to power and desire, but he did neither. He maintained the principle that truth belongs to eternity, while applying it to the disorder of society. The two worlds clash, but within that tension lies the core of philosophy. The eternal offers guidance, the visible provides context. The philosopher's role is to keep them united, even if the connection bends. Without the eternal, there is no truth to pursue. Without daily life, there is no arena to test meaning. Together, they create the drama that defines not only Plato, but also the tradition that follows him. Later thinkers repeatedly faced the same challenge. Ideals challenged by politics, truths strained by experience, theory tested against practice. Each step carried forward the same tension he initiated. Philosophy develops within that space, not outside it. And so we conclude with the image of a thinker caught between clarity and confusion, plan and stone, vision and practice. Plato's brilliance lay not only in naming the eternal, but in striving to demonstrate how it could matter within time. His system, despite its flaws, endured because he refused both extremes, neither to lose truth nor to abandon society. He constantly worked at their intersection, where worlds collide. This raises a question for us. If philosophy exists at the point of collision, what do we consider our plan? And how do we implement it amidst the roughness of life? That tension characterizes each strand of his project. It forms the basis of his legacy, and it naturally prompts us to pause and ask, across all his themes, what image of unity emerges when the parts are viewed together? Plato's journey united love, knowledge, justice, art, and politics into a single interconnected vision. Each theme could stand alone, but within his thought, they supported each other, forming a fabric stretched between timeless ideals and everyday realities. The question becomes how these tensions manifest in your own life and in the world around you. Ancient answers are not locked away in the past. They guide reflection whenever you consider desire versus wisdom or fairness versus power. Plato's dialogue between the real and the ideal continues quietly, shaping how we think and act today.